Welcome everyone to our presentation on essential functions in the workplace. My name is Dustin Schwab and I am a career development specialist here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. Today I am co-hosting with my colleague Julie Wood. Julie, please introduce yourself and tell us about today's webinar topic.
Thank you, Dustin, and hi everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Julie Wood, and I am OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist. I am also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. One of my responsibilities at the agency is to create and deliver presentations that are focused on helping employers create accessible workplaces and navigate their responsibilities under Title I of the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. In today's webinar, we will discuss how to identify and describe essential functions, and then how to use them effectively in the workplace.
Thank you, Julie. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's training comes with a learner's guide and helpful fact sheet, which can be accessed now through the link that is posted in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information that we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice, but we do hope this information is helpful for you. We will be stopping about halfway through today's presentation and again before we conclude to answer any questions, so please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the presentation so that they're ready for us when we stop. Okay, Julie, can you give us an overview of what all we will be covering during today's discussion?
Yes, first we will define what essential functions are, share ways to determine a job's essential functions, and describe how to record them in an inclusive way. And then we will discuss the important role essential functions have in the hiring process and during employment.
So you said we would start with defining essential functions, which I think is a great idea. Is there a definition out there to tell me exactly what we mean with the phrase essential function?
Yes, Dustin, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the EEOC, regulates and enforces Title I of the ADA, and in their guidance, they define essential functions as the basic job duties an applicant or employee with a disability must be able to perform with or without reasonable accommodation. So these basic job duties are those critical tasks that must be completed to meet the job's expectations. And if these tasks were removed, doing so would fundamentally change the job.
Thank you. That will definitely help guide the rest of our discussion. So, does the ADA or any other law require employers to identify essential functions or create job descriptions?
Dustin, I can speak to what the EEOC guidance says about essential functions and job descriptions, but employers may want to check whether other laws have requirements that apply to them. The EEOC states employers should examine their jobs to identify their essential functions prior to recruiting and hiring for a job or making employment decisions. The EEOC does not require employers to create job descriptions. However, many employers do, and it is a best practice to include essential functions in job descriptions.
So then, why do essential functions matter?
Dustin, essential functions matter for a variety of reasons, beginning with their direct tie to Title I of the ADA. Title I has two main purposes. One is to prohibit employment discrimination based on disability. The other is to require covered employers to provide reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities when they are needed, to compete for jobs, to perform jobs, and to participate in the benefits of employment. To receive this protection under Title I, an individual must have a disability according to the ADA's definition of disability, and they must be qualified for the job. Being qualified means the individual meets the employer's job-related qualification standards and can perform the job's essential functions with or without a reasonable accommodation. So essential functions matter to individuals with disabilities and to employers because both parties use these to determine whether the individual is qualified. but essential functions are important for more than just determining qualification. Today, we will discuss how describing essential functions in an inclusive way matters because doing so may help an employer attract more qualified candidates to consider for their open positions, which may ultimately lead to finding the best person for the job. Employers can also use essential functions to formulate the questions they ask during their interviews, which matters because this can help to determine whether an individual is qualified. And essential functions matter because they are helpful when an employer is evaluating performance and determining an effective reasonable accommodation during the interactive process. We will discuss all of this in today's presentation. So why do they matter, Dustin? Because essential functions are tied to Title I, and they provide a foundation for conducting the hiring process and employment in an inclusive way.
I think you brought up a great point that individuals with disabilities might use essential functions to determine that they are able to perform a job. Are essential functions inclusive of all the aspects of a job?
Dustin, the EEOC does provide guidance, but first I'd like to address that employers are permitted under the ADA to create and change their jobs and the tasks that are required to perform them. These tasks are typically a combination of essential functions and marginal functions. We know the essential functions are those main duties the job was created to perform, and the marginal functions are those less critical tasks of the job. For example, one of my job's essential functions is to research Title I of the ADA, and another one is to provide customized education for employers on accessibility and accommodations, whether it's through an informative email, a formal report, or a presentation like today's webinar. Now, sometimes to support my work, I need to print documents, and there have been times when I go to the printer and it's out of paper. So one of my job's marginal functions is to refill the paper in the printer.
Okay, so you've got me thinking about my job. I do a lot of different tasks on a daily basis, and to me, they almost all seem essential. How does an employer distinguish what is an essential function? Does the EEOC have any advice to help employers with this?
So the good news is employers can decide which tasks of the job are essential and which are marginal. And as I mentioned, the EEOC provides guidance or factors for employers to consider when making this determination. Each employer is unique, and so these factors can be helpful for employers because they serve as a guide employers can use to thoroughly analyze their jobs to decide which tasks are essential functions. One factor the EEOC states to consider is whether the job was created to perform the task. When we look at my example, my job was created to provide education for employers on worksite accessibility and accommodations. To do this, I researched Title I of the ADA, compile information and resources, and then customize the delivery of this information to employers. So these are some of my job's essential functions. However, my job was not created to refill the paper in the printer, and so even though I perform this task, this factor would suggest it's not essential. It's a marginal function. Employers can also consider the number of employees who are available to perform the task or with whom the task can be distributed amongst. In my example, the task of refilling the printer paper is a task I share with my colleagues. It's really just your turn to do this when you are the one who notices the printer is out of paper and you need to print something. So this factor further supports this task being a marginal function. The EEOC also advises employers to consider the level of skill or expertise required to perform the task. In my job description, there was a level of skill or expertise required for educating employers on topics like worksite accessibility and reasonable accommodations, such as being an occupational therapist or an ergonomist or a physical therapist. So this factor further supports this task being an essential function. Now, no one factor is meant to be the only factor an employer considers, but collectively, these all help employers to fully examine the tasks associated with a job to determine which are essential and which are marginal.
Julie, these factors are helpful, and the EEOC has additional considerations employers can use to determine whether aspects of a job are essential. What are those?
Dustin, because there may be times when the EEOC is mediating a charge with an employer and determining whether a task is an essential function, they have published guidance of what they consider evidence of a task being essential. And so that evidence can be used by employers who are proactively identifying their job's essential functions along with the factors we just described. And so here is the list. The EEOC will consider the employer's judgment that a task is an essential function. Even though it's not required by the EEOC, they will consider a job description that was written before advertising or interviewing for the job. They will consider the work experience of past and present employees who have performed the job. They will consider the amount of time spent performing the task. They will consider the consequences of a task not being performed, and they will consider the terms of a collective bargaining agreement. Now, this list is not all-inclusive, and no individual item is meant to be more relevant than the other, but it is a helpful list to reference when identifying which tasks of the job are essential functions.
Some of these factors and guidance seem technical. It might be helpful for employers to have a little more in-depth information about the differences between them. Where can employers find further guidance on these factors and evidence?
Dustin, you are right. This information can seem technical. Because each employer's work environment and jobs are unique, it may be difficult to know how some of these apply. And since we only have an hour on this topic, I am going to share 3 resources that may be helpful if anyone would like additional information. First, the Job Accommodation Network, which is known as JAN, has the Technical Assistance Manual for Title I of the ADA on its website. And this resource goes into more depth about this list of factors and evidence we just discussed and provides examples. So that's a great place to start. The next resource is for creating job descriptions. Now, we said the ADA does not require employers to create job descriptions. However, many employers do. And so JAN has another helpful resource on its website called Job Description Topics. And this goes into detail about what job descriptions are, identifies reasons you may want to use job descriptions, and then shares best practices for creating them. So both of these JAN resources are included in our learner's guide. In addition, our employer partners are welcome to contact me for a worksite accessibility consultation, which allows us to discuss these topics in more depth, but also in a more customized way that applies to the employer's unique workplace and jobs.
These resources sound very helpful. So you mentioned that essential functions are important because they can help an employer make the hiring process inclusive. One of the most important topics that we want to cover today is how to write essential functions that are inclusive of people with disabilities. This means that they are written with language that opens the possibility of completing tasks in different ways. Now that we've described the ways for employers to identify their job's essential functions, Julie, do you have any tips on how essential functions can be written to be inclusive of people with disabilities?
I do, Dustin. Once you've identified your job's essential functions, the next step is to describe them and make a record of them, possibly in a written format included in a job description. So the first tip I want to talk about is describing essential functions in an outcome-based way. Although we may customarily perform a job a certain way, there is often more than one way to complete a task just as effectively. This is a key concept to embrace when we think about being inclusive in the workplace, because an individual whose disability limits their ability to perform an essential function in the customary way it's always been done is likely able to perform the task just as effectively in another way, using a reasonable accommodation. So how an essential function is described and recorded should be focused on the purpose of the task and its desired outcome instead of on the way the task has always been performed.
Okay, so let's practice this. One task that I do often at work is type notes from the meetings I attend. Can you reword that task to be outcome-based?
Sure, so customarily the task you described may have been stated that the essential function is to type or write down notes during weekly meetings. When it's described this way, it implies the employee has to physically type or write the notes taken during the meeting. But really, the purpose of the task is to capture the content of the meeting to reference at another time. So if we reword this to be outcome-based, it can be stated that the essential function is to record notes during meetings. When it's written this way, which is based on the outcome, then it opens up the possibility for the task to be performed in more than one way.
Great. Now that we have reworded the essential function, let's consider several of the different ways in which notes can be recorded. I originally said I type notes. Julie, you mentioned writing notes. What other way might a person record notes with or without a reasonable accommodation?
Dustin, another way this outcome can be achieved is by using a speech-to-text device. For example, there are smart pens which can record what they hear during a meeting, and then this audio recording can be uploaded to a computer into a document. An employee could then edit these notes and distribute them to the team.
That sounds like it might be more accurate and efficient too. Can you share one more example of writing an outcome-based essential function?
I have a short example from Jan that includes an essential function for an IT professional that has been written in the customary way the task has always been done. It states the task as the ability to read technical manuals. So if we reword this to be outcome-based, it can be stated that the essential function is the ability to learn technical material. When it's written this way, which is based on the outcome, it makes the task inclusive of being performed in more than one way.
And what might be an example of another way to learn the information?
Dustin, an individual may choose to listen to an audio recording that contains the same information as the written manual.
Perfect. So someone might also benefit from an accommodation like a job coach who can help demonstrate the technical material that the individual is trying to learn, which if you'd like more information about job coaches, we have an on-demand webinar on our webpage titled Job Developers and Job Coaches in the Workplace. Okay, Julie, the other tip you wanted to share is about language. What should employers do to ensure the language used for essential functions is inclusive?
Dustin, the words we use in our communications in the workplace make a difference when it comes to inclusion. The best practices we will share apply to a variety of kinds of communication, including essential functions. So the first tip is to use plain language in your communications, which means you are being clear and concise and using words that have a single meaning. When you are using words that can be interpreted in more than one way, provide a definition of these words. Another tip is to avoid using jargon, technical terms, and proprietary names, or if you feel these need to be included, then provide a description or a definition of these. And the final tip is to avoid using any unnecessary words, terms, or phrases.
The way in which an employer describes a job's physical requirements can also be restrictive. Julie, can we review some physical terms and how they can be written in essential functions more inclusively?
Sure, so we have a resource from Pace University that provides examples of words that describe the physical demands of a job in more of the customary way the job has always been done, and then suggest more inclusive word choices for that physical task. For example, it's customary to use words like sit and stand when describing a job's essential functions. However, it may not always be the case that the only way to do the job is to sit or stand. It may be that the job requires the employee to maintain a stationary position to achieve the outcome of the task, and it doesn't matter if that is through sitting or standing. So instead of stating that the essential function is to sit or stand to complete a task, it could be written that the essential function is to maintain a stationary position to complete the task. Again, when we write essential functions using inclusive language, we support the possibility of the job task being performed effectively in another way.
Maybe we can quickly review some examples of how these changes might expand the way each task can be completed. Julie, how does the term stationary position as opposed to sit or stand open up this job task to being performed in different ways?
Dustin, let's say a candidate is reviewing the job description for a front desk hotel clerk position. The job description states one of the job's essential functions is to stand for prolonged periods to check in guests when they arrive. The candidate has a disability that limits the ability to stand for more than 1 hour at a time. So based on the job description, the candidate doesn't think they're qualified for the job and doesn't apply. If instead the job description states one of the essential functions is to maintain a stationary position for prolonged periods to check in guests, the candidate knows they can use a standing height stool and sit for prolonged periods to perform this essential function, and so now feels qualified and applies for the job. So this rewording makes this job more inclusive by opening the task up to being performed in more than one way, which results in more candidates being qualified for the position, which gives the employer more candidates to consider when selecting the most qualified person for the job.
That makes it clearer. Someone can remain in one position or area throughout the day without the specification of how they remain in that position. So now let's talk about navigating the workplace. How do the terms move or traverse include more people than the term walk?
Dustin, using words like move or traverse opens up more ways to navigate the workplace than walking. An employee with a physical disability that limits walking may use a wheelchair or a motorized scooter to effectively navigate throughout the workplace to complete work tasks. So again, we are making this job more inclusive by inviting more ways to perform the job.
Julie, you and I recently discussed a job description that listed talk as an essential function. I know that the term communicate might be a more inclusive way to describe this task because a person with a disability that limits speaking might use a speech device to communicate. How else might words like communicate or exchange information include more people than talk or hear?
Dustin, words like communicate and exchange information include more people because these words are focused on the outcome of the task, whereas words like talk or hear are focused on how to perform the task. There are many ways a person can communicate and exchange information at work. In addition to talking and hearing, a person could communicate by using a speech device, as you mentioned, but also through sign language interpretation, or the use of gestures and lip reading, or through written communications like text messaging or chatting through a virtual platform, or sending emails. So replacing words like talk and hear with a more inclusive word like communicate is another way we open up this job task to individuals who can communicate just as effectively in another way, which can attract more qualified candidates for the job.
There are also alternatives to the word see. What are some examples of job tasks that might be described using terms like determine and identify?
Dustin, Jan has an example of an employee who is blind working as an administrative assistant managing a multiple line phone system. In this role, the employee needed to be able to determine which line was ringing. Customarily, this was determined by a flashing light. However, the employee couldn't see this indicator. So the telephone console was modified so each line had a unique ring sound, so the employee could determine which line was ringing by the sound of the ring. So when we replace the word see with the word determine, we allow for an employee to determine which line is ringing, either by seeing the flashing light or by hearing the designated sound. Another example from Jan is an employee who is colorblind and working as an engineer. The firm he works for organizes projects by color. So when they print materials, employees rely on seeing the color to quickly know which project they are working on. The employee was not able to see the colors, so this method was not useful for him. The accommodation options that were discussed included organizing the projects in another way, such as including a written phrase or symbol on the printed materials, or providing the employee with a handheld color identifier he could use. So when we replace the word see with the word identify, we allow for an employee to identify which project they are working on by seeing the color, by identifying a written indicator, or by using an item like the handheld color identifier.
So the employee had to identify the correct project on which he was working rather than see the color on the material. That makes sense. I know that many job descriptions use the term lift in their essential functions. How can more people be included when an employer rephrases this term to move or transport?
Dustin, first, let me say that if an employer has assessed a job and determined the only way to perform the task is to lift, it is okay to state that as the essential function. However, often there is another way to perform the task, and when a more inclusive word like move or transport is used, it allows for this task to be performed another way. So here's another example from Jan. A job description was updated to be more inclusive, and instead of describing an essential function as lifts cases of product from truck to store, it was rewritten as moving beverage cases weighing up to 50 pounds from delivery truck into store. The outcome of this task is to get the product from the truck to the store. One employee may do this by lifting the case from the truck and carrying it to the store. Another employee may push the product to the edge of the truck, maneuver it to a cart at approximately the same height, and then push it to the store. Another employee may perform a two-person lift to maneuver the case to a dolly and then push the dolly to the store.
I think you brought up a good point there, Julie, that sometimes the physical task is truly necessary for the essential function to be performed. A lifeguard, for example, probably does have to be able to see to do their job. Starting with the outcome, though, like you suggested, helps to identify whether the physical description is required. Thank you for these examples, which demonstrate the many ways the job tasks can be performed. Once an employer has determined the outcome of the essential function, do you have any practical suggestions for how they should write the essential function statement?
Dustin, I do have a resource from HR Guide, which gives a suggestion on how to write essential function statements, which they refer to as duty statements. They provide examples that are outcome-based, using action words, and written in a way that allows for the task to be performed in more than one way. HR Guide suggests the statement be constructed using a verb, an object, and the purpose. So I have an example from their website. The statement is written as collects financial data to evaluate budget requests. So the word collects is the verb, the phrase financial data is the object, and the purpose is to evaluate budget requests.
Thank you, Julie. And we have included this resource in the learner's guide as well. So, okay, let's take a break to see what questions have come in. Julie, the first question is, what about job carving? What are the possibilities to hire a candidate to do part of a job identified by the job description?
So when we're talking about essential functions from our perspective, we're talking about competitive and integrated employment. So the jobs that you post for all applicants to consider. When you choose to carve out a job as an employer, that's your decision if you're moving forward with just asking any employee to perform certain aspects of the job. What the EEOC says about essential functions is that you as an employer never have to remove an essential function as a form of reasonable accommodation, but if you wish to, you can. And so in that case, if you want to identify certain tasks of a job as a person's duty for their job responsibilities, you're permitted as the employer to do that.
Thank you. Another question we have is, Julie, what is the difference between qualification standards and essential functions?
That's a good question because those two really do go hand in hand. Today we wanted to focus our conversation on essential functions, and qualification standards kind of precede those. And so a qualification standard includes things like the experience that is required for the job, education, maybe certain physical or mental skills. And employers are permitted to create their qualification standards just as they are permitted to create their job's essential functions. And certainly the EEOC provides guidance for creating qualification standards. And these can be written inclusively as well. But employers use qualification standards really mostly to predict a candidate's ability to perform the job's essential functions. And so customarily we'll look at whether somebody meets the qualification standards first, and then assess whether or not they meet the essential functions. We did speak to the topic of qualification standards in our webinar on supervisors in Title I of the ADA, and that is available on demand on the employers page of our website, and so we do have additional information on that topic in that training.
Cool, thank you. And Julie, how are the terms of a collective bargaining agreement used to determine essential functions, or how can they be used?
So that's a good question, because we listed that as one of the factors employers can consider when they're determining what tasks are essential. And so why this is included as an example of a factor is because sometimes employers will include a list of the job duties in an agreement like that. And so that would be a point of reference that you could use when you're deciding as an employer whether a certain job task is an essential function or not. Again, none of those factors is meant to be the only consideration an employer makes when considering which task is an essential function, but it is certainly one resource an employer could turn to.
Great. And maybe one more question. Can we say it's an essential function to lift 30 pounds?
So we kind of talked about the physical part of the job and whether or not it's required to do things like lift to perform the outcome of the task. And so, you know, we mentioned that if it is the requirement to lift something, you can state that. What's important to know is that you really want to look at this first from the outcome of the task. You know, what is the purpose of what the employee is doing, and what are all the ways that outcome can be achieved? So we gave some examples that maybe it could be a two-person lift, maybe a cart or a dolly could be used, maybe there's a lifting device. But if you as the employer determine the only way to perform the task is to lift, then yes, you could indicate that. This is just a reminder to maybe look at it more globally to say what are all the different ways that we could perform this before we just land on saying we have to be able to lift.
All right, cool. Thank you all for your great questions, and thank you, Julie, for answering those. Just as a reminder, we'll be taking one more question break before we finish. So if you have more questions as we go along, please feel free to post them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So Julie, now that we understand what essential functions are, how to identify them, and how to rate them inclusively, let's talk about the role essential functions have in the hiring process and during employment. At the beginning of this presentation, you said that both employers and candidates use essential functions to determine whether the individual is qualified for the job. Can you help explain how including essential functions in job postings and job descriptions might increase the talent pool of qualified applicants for employers to consider?
Sure, Dustin. Finding the right person for the job begins with recruitment. It's helpful to remember that candidates who are interested in your jobs will determine whether they're qualified partly based on the essential functions you include. When you write these in a way that is outcome-based and inclusive, a candidate with a disability who can achieve the outcome of the essential function in a way that is not customary to how it's always done will know they are qualified and may apply for the job. Also, when essential functions are written this way, it can send a message to the candidate that you are a disability inclusive employer, which may further encourage qualified candidates with disabilities to apply. So both reasons can lead to attracting more qualified candidates to consider for your open positions.
That makes sense. So when essential functions are included in job postings and written inclusively, Candidates with disabilities will recognize how they are qualified for the position. As a result, the employer's applicant pool increases because people are aware that they meet the minimum requirements of the position. I think we now have a good idea of why including essential functions in job descriptions and job postings is important. But what about during interviews? Julie, how can employers utilize essential functions during this stage of the hiring process?
Dustin, the hiring process includes the pre-employment process, which is made up of the pre-offer phase and the post-offer phase. In the pre-offer phase, employers are not permitted to ask disability-related questions or administer medical exams, and this is to ensure hiring decisions are based on the ability to perform the job's essential functions, not based on disability. The goal then of the pre-offer phase, which includes the interview, is to determine whether the candidate can do the job, and so questions should be focused on the job's essential functions. Remember, the ADA requires employers to determine whether a candidate with a disability is qualified for the job based on their ability to perform the job's essential functions. So employers can make this determination and obtain the information they need during the interview through the questions they ask all candidates about performing the job's essential functions. And there's a few ways to go about this. First, the interviewer could ask each candidate if they have reviewed the job's essential functions before the interview, or provide them with a list during the interview and then ask all candidates whether they can perform these with or without a reasonable accommodation. Or the interviewer could ask all candidates to describe or demonstrate how they would perform a particular essential function with or without a reasonable accommodation. For example, an employer may describe an essential function of the job that requires the ability to move 25-pound boxes from where they are stacked on shelves at varying heights to a pallet on the ground level. The employer could explain that task and ask the candidate how they would accomplish it.
Julie, I noticed that your example utilized the inclusive language that we discussed. You indicated the outcome, which was moving the boxes to ground level, and then you used the inclusive verb move rather than a physical term like lift. So let's go back to the essential function that we used earlier, recording notes. What can an employer ask to ensure a candidate is able to meet this essential function?
Dustin, the example we used said the essential function is to record notes during meetings. One suggestion is to state that one of the job's essential functions is to record what is said during weekly team meetings and then distribute these notes to the team later. The employer could then ask the candidate, can you perform this task with or without a reasonable accommodation?
So Julie, it seems like a best practice then would be for employers to train their hiring professionals to focus their interview questions on the ability of all people to do the job. When developing questions for interviews, hiring managers might consider including questions related to essential functions. In doing so, they will avoid situations where they are unsure if they can ask a question of a candidate with an apparent disability. Okay. Now that we have applied and interviewed, let's move to the period after accepting an employment offer, but before starting the job. What role do essential functions have in this phase?
Dustin, once a conditional offer is made, employers are permitted to ask disability-related questions and administer medical examinations. If they choose to do so, these questions and exams must apply to all candidates who receive a job offer in the same job category. The offer is permitted to be conditioned on the results. If the results lead to the employer screening out a candidate with a disability, this decision must be job-related and consistent with business necessity. Now, this is a common phrase you will find in all the EEOC guidance. Job-related means things like qualification standards, tests, performance measures, or selection criterion applies to a specific job, not a general class of jobs. Consistent with business necessity means these same things apply to the essential functions of a specific job. This is where essential functions play a role in the post-offer phase of pre-employment. So generally, this means if an employer asks a disability-related question or administers a medical exam of all candidates during the post-offer phase and decides, based on the result of these, to not hire a candidate with a disability, this decision to screen out the candidate must be related to the job's essential functions. And before this final decision is made to screen out a candidate with a disability, reasonable accommodation must be considered. And that is because we know a reasonable accommodation may enable an individual with a disability to perform the job just as effectively in another way. So by having essential functions identified before the hiring process begins, it helps employers to determine when candidates are qualified for the job and helps employers prevent errors when making decisions that screen out candidates with disabilities.
Okay, Julie, so the hiring process can be used to identify candidates who are capable of performing a job's essential functions. When an employee has begun a job, what can the employer do if that employee is not able to perform an essential function as indicated on their job description?
Well, Dustin, first of all, once a candidate becomes an employee, the employer can no longer ask disability-related questions or require medical exams, unless the employer can show these are job-related and consistent with business necessity. And remember, consistent with business necessity means it applies to the job's essential functions. And this applies to all employees, not just employees with disabilities. The best way to measure an employee's ability to do a job is by evaluating their performance of work tasks. Just like the best way to determine a candidate is qualified in the interview is to ask about the job's essential functions, not about disability. Similar to how Title I generally does not prevent employers from creating jobs and things like qualification standards and essential functions, Title I also does not prevent employers from establishing performance expectations, quality standards, or consequences for low performance. When work performance is being evaluated, all employees should be evaluated the same way using the same criteria, including employees with disabilities. We said earlier that an employee with a disability is expected to be qualified for the job, which means the employee is expected to meet the same performance expectations for the job's essential functions as all employees. However, sometimes an employee with a disability is performing the essential functions using a reasonable accommodation, and when that is the case, the evaluation may need to be altered to measure the performance in another way.
I think that is an important point. We encourage employers to write essential functions inclusively to support the job being performed in more than one way, possibly using a reasonable accommodation. When an individual with a disability uses a reasonable accommodation to do the job, it makes sense that how the individual is evaluated may have to be altered. The individual is still expected to perform the essential function effectively, after all. But the way that essential function is performed may be different than other employees due to the accommodation. So what happens when a performance evaluation reveals low performance?
Dustin, low performance should generally be addressed with all employees the same way, including employees with disabilities. It is helpful to know that when an evaluation reveals low performance, it may be the employee's first indication that their disability is contributing to their ability to do the job. So when this occurs, the employee may choose to disclose their disability and may request a reasonable accommodation. We know employees with disabilities can disclose a disability and request a reasonable accommodation at any time. So if this happens in response to a low performance review, the employer must begin the interactive process right away and consider reasonable accommodation.
Julie, you mentioned the interactive process, so let's discuss its relationship to essential functions. Just to review, the interactive process is the collaboration between an individual and the employer when the individual requests a reasonable accommodation. It's informal and can be initiated at any time during the hiring process or during employment. So how do individuals with disabilities know to request an accommodation if they need one?
Dustin, if employers include a reasonable accommodation statement in key locations, including their job descriptions, then candidates and employees with disabilities will be informed of their right to reasonable accommodation and of how to make a request if they need one. A reasonable accommodation statement can send a message to individuals that this is a disability inclusive workplace and can help foster an inclusive culture, both of which may help individuals with disabilities feel more comfortable to request what they need.
That's a great point. And we included a link in the learner's guide to a resource from Jan that provides examples of reasonable accommodation statements for employers to review. Now, how can employers utilize essential functions during the interactive process?
Dustin, employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations to enable individuals with disabilities to perform the job's essential functions. So essential functions that are already identified can be a useful tool for employers during this process. When essential functions are written in an outcome-based way with inclusive language, like we've described today, it can help employers imagine or be open to other ways to perform the job. The guidance from the EEOC provides many types of reasonable accommodations to help illustrate the many ways work tasks can be performed in another way. These include making the work environment accessible, restructuring the job, permitting a flexible schedule, altering or providing equipment or services, modifying policies, and providing reassignment. Restructuring the job speaks directly to the job's essential functions, and so we are going to discuss that type of accommodation in more detail. The remaining types of reasonable accommodations are discussed in our on-demand webinar, the Employer's ADA Handbook, Reasonable Accommodations and Undue Hardship, which is available on the OOD website and referenced in the Learner's Guide.
Julie, the implementation of some of these accommodations seems obvious. However, I noticed you emphasized restructuring the job. What does this mean and how does an employer do it?
Dustin, this includes either redistributing the marginal functions of a job or modifying how marginal or essential functions are performed. So just as a quick review, the essential functions are the job's fundamental and critical duties, and the marginal functions are those job duties that are considered tangential or not as critical. Now, employers do not have to eliminate or redistribute the job's essential functions, and this is because these are the tasks an employee with a disability is expected to be qualified to perform with or without a reasonable accommodation. However, an employer can eliminate or redistribute these if they wish to. When an employer decides to redistribute the marginal functions of the job as a form of reasonable accommodation, they can consider reallocating or swapping the marginal functions from another job to the responsibilities of the employee with a disability if these are tasks the employee can perform.
That seems manageable. Can you provide some examples of restructuring a job?
Dustin, we have some examples directly from Jan that I will share. The first describes a cleaning crew working in an office building. One crew member wears a prosthetic leg, which limits his ability to climb steps. He can perform the job's essential functions, but cannot perform one of the marginal functions, which includes sweeping the steps in a few locations in the building. Another crew member performs the marginal function of cleaning a small kitchen in the employee break area, and this is a task the first crew member can perform. So as a reasonable accommodation, the employer can swap the two crew members' marginal duties. Another example from Jan indicates that an employee's disability makes it impossible for him to perform a certain essential function in the morning. And so as a reasonable accommodation, the employer permitted this essential function to be performed later in the day. And one final example is that an employee with a disability that impacts memory has difficulty remembering the order of his work tasks. And so the job was restructured to include a checklist of tasks the employee could reference to indicate that a task was completed and to enable him to remember which task to do next.
I can see where having a job description that describes the job's essential functions and marginal functions will help employers and their employees make decisions about reasonable accommodations. Julie, before we stop for more questions, can you talk a little bit about how employers can ensure an employee's accommodation is actually helping that employee perform the job's essential functions?
Yes, once you implement a reasonable accommodation, it's important to monitor the accommodation for effectiveness. Sometimes we don't know whether an accommodation will work until we try it. Also, sometimes reasonable accommodations can stop being effective, either due to a change in the employee's disability or a change in the workplace. One example of a change in the workplace is when an employer makes a change to the job's essential functions. Employers are permitted to change their job's essential functions, so when this happens, be mindful that this can lead to an employee with a disability needing a different reasonable accommodation. In that case, revisit the interactive process to determine another accommodation that is effective. So for these reasons, it's always important to communicate with the employee to contact you if the accommodation stops being effective, so the employee has what he or she needs to do the job or access the work environment.
Inviting the employee to contact you if an accommodation is no longer effective is a great point. Julie, earlier you mentioned that it is helpful to include a reasonable accommodation statement in key locations. So informing an employee what to do if a reasonable accommodation is no longer effective is kind of like extending that reasonable accommodation statement to an employee who is already using a reasonable accommodation. Okay, let's take one more break to see what questions we have. The first question, Julie, I think is kind of an extension of the question earlier, and I think they just want clarification that they understand correctly. So employers do not have to remove essential functions if a reasonable accommodation is not able to be made for an employee to fulfill the essential functions. However, an employer is free to further accommodate by changing the essential functions necessary for an employee to complete. Is that correct?
This is a great point to just say again and reemphasize that individuals with disabilities are required to be qualified for your job to receive protection under Title I, and that means that the individual is able to perform the job's essential functions. And so employers are not required to remove the essential functions of the job as a form of reasonable accommodation. You can if you want to, you're not required to. What you can consider as a form of reasonable accommodation is altering the way the essential function is performed through reasonable accommodation. You are permitted to remove the marginal functions. That is a form of reasonable accommodation, is to remove those or to swap those. And so, yes, an employer is not required to remove an essential function, but certainly we want to look at how we could perform that essential function in another way through reasonable accommodation.
Great. If a candidate requests or asks for a reasonable accommodation during an interview to demonstrate how they would perform an essential function, what should the employer do?
Right, so we said an employee or an applicant with a disability can request an accommodation at any time during the hiring process or during employment. And so if part of your interview process is to ask all candidates to demonstrate how they would perform a task, if an applicant asks you for an accommodation to be able to demonstrate, what options you have as an employer is, if you have that accommodation, then provide that to the candidate so they can use that accommodation to demonstrate to you how they would perform the essential function. You may not have that exact accommodation on hand. If you happen to have another accommodation that's effective, you could use that. And if in the moment you don't have this accommodation, which could occur, you could ask the candidate to describe how they would use that accommodation to perform that essential function.
Thank you. What should an employer do if the employer is interviewing someone who has an obvious disability and the employer isn't really sure if the disability would limit the person's ability to perform some of the job's essential functions?
Yeah, that's a great question to discuss, because we describe asking questions in the interview about essential functions to all candidates. If you're in a situation where you're interviewing a candidate with an obvious disability and you as the employer reasonably believe that candidate may have a limitation with performing an essential function, you can ask the candidate to describe or demonstrate how they would perform the task, even if you didn't ask the others to do that. But it has to be that you reasonably believe that the candidate would have a limitation in performing the task.
Awesome. And Maybe one more question. If an employee receives a low performance review and then discloses a disability and requests a reasonable accommodation, can the employer still apply its consequences for low performance?
The answer to that is yes. So what happens in this situation is you kind of go down two paths at the same time. So if you are reviewing low performance with an employee who chooses that moment to disclose a disability and attributes that to the low performance and requests an accommodation, then you begin the interactive process because a disability has been disclosed and an accommodation has been requested. However, reasonable accommodation is future oriented, which is referred to as prospective in the EEOC guidance. And so it doesn't negate an employer applying its performance consequences. And so you can apply the consequences, but you also start the interactive process. What I would like to suggest is that you consider maybe pausing certain consequences for low performance until you can implement the reasonable accommodation. So you do give the individual the ability to apply the reasonable accommodation to the performance to see if it's going to be effective.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for, oh, I think one more question came in. Since you answered that, what about a pregnant woman who can no longer complete essential functions?
So pregnancy itself is not a disability. Being pregnant sometimes can lead to conditions that would rise to the level of a disability. So the first thing you do in that situation as an employer during the interactive process, you are permitted to verify that a disability exists, and you are permitted to do that by getting medical documentation when the disability or the need for the accommodation is not obvious to you. So in this case, if you're in the interactive process and a person has a disability, then you would move through your process to identify the effective reasonable accommodation.
Okay, and then I guess one more came in as well. So quickly, in the teleworking environment, how do you analyze essential functions when the requests directly and solely involve working from home?
So telework can be a form of reasonable accommodation. It was a form of accommodation before the pandemic, and then certainly during the pandemic when so many were working remotely, we learned a lot about telework. And so there's some guidance from the EEOC from the pandemic, but also prior to. So how you evaluate this as an employer is really how you evaluate any reasonable accommodation, is you want to rely on those essential functions and learn how the accommodation is going to enable the individual to perform the job's essential functions. When we're talking about the remote work environment, you will want to consider which tasks can be performed remotely. Sometimes certain tasks have to be performed on site, and that's going to be unique for each employer. You would want to look at if you have any in-person obligations, so meeting with customers or colleagues. You would want to look at if certain tools or equipment is required, and is it reasonable to provide that in the remote environment. And so there's a variety of ways that you look at this to identify if the essential functions can be performed in the remote environment. Could be that you arrive at a place where some have to be performed on site, some can be performed in the remote environment, and so you look at some kind of a combination of telework. And you also want to consider, can we supervise the employer or the employee performing the essential functions in the remote environment? The answer that you arrive at is going to be unique to each employer because we know each job, each person are unique. So those are some of the things that you would consider.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie. And thank you all for your great questions. Julie, before we finish, do you have any final thoughts?
I do. Thank you, Dustin. So today we discussed how candidates rely on essential functions when they are reviewing job postings and job descriptions to know they are qualified for the job. When employers include essential functions that are written inclusively in these key areas, it can help employers attract more qualified candidates for their open positions. So this gives employers more candidates to consider when searching for the right person for the job. And when an employee with a disability requests a reasonable accommodation to perform the job, employers can rely on their inclusively written essential functions to help facilitate the interactive process and successfully identify a reasonable accommodation so the employee can perform the job just as effectively in another way. I hope this information has been helpful for you. And as a reminder, our employer partners can contact me for a worksite accessibility consultation to address this or other accessibility topics unique to your workplace. I certainly appreciate your interest in today's topic, so thank you for being here. And Dustin, it's always wonderful to present with you.